Deputy Catherine Connolly to move the motion.
And I want to formally move the motion. And I'm sharing my time with Deputy Pringle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laskinculla. Minister, it is with pride that I move this motion today. It's something that I promised on the day I was elected, further to representations from many, many people throughout Ireland, but in particular in Galway and the western counties, in relation to the protection of seaweed as a natural resource. And I'll come back to your amendment, which is short. I'll come back to it later in my delivery. But just at this moment, this must be the most wonderful opportunity to deal with our natural resources, seaweed, and to learn from the debacle that happened in relation to our fishing rights, in relation to our gas and oil. And if we don't learn now in this Dáil with new politics, we're never going to learn. So even though you've tabled an amendment, I would ask you to reflect when you hear the debate today in relation to this matter, because myself and my colleagues worked hard on this motion, and we tabled it in such a way to include all of the Dáil, so that it would have unanimous support across all parties. And the motion is simply, first of all, foremost, recognising the work that has gone in by the traditional harvesters all over the west coast of Ireland in relation to harvesting seaweed in a sustainable manner and in protecting that national resource for all of us. Secondly, I looked, and my colleagues looked, at all of the reports, and I have a section of them here before us. And if we look at that, each and every single report points to the role of traditional harvesters, number one, and it points to the importance of protecting our national our aquanádúra, our natural resource, for the good of most of the people. Indeed, údarás na Gaeltachta, when they were before on cócasta cóhíl culture agus Gaeltacht, made this very point, that this sector must be developed for the common good for the maximum number of people. So the last report I've looked at is the report of the Committee on Developing the Seaweed Industry in Ireland, May 2015. Prior to that, we had a report in January 14 from the Joint Subcommittee on Fisheries. Prior to that, we had other reports, and going back to 2000, we had a national forum on the seaweed industry. All of those reports identified what I've said, the role of traditional harvesters, number one, but the second thing was the key issues, the importance of sustainability, the lack of research in relation to the detrimental effects. We know there are detrimental effects, but the extent of those detrimental effects on seaweed, of mechanical harvesting and so on. The current situation, we have 17, as I think from all of the Dáil questions tabled by various TDs, we have 17 applications pending before your department, most of them companies looking for licences. Now, in your response, you tell us that you're working on sorting out those difficulties, presumably then with the view to granting licences. And my difficulty with that is all of the reports that I have mentioned, and others besides, have all mentioned the urgent need for a policy, a national policy, in relation to developing the sector of seaweed in a sustainable manner. There is no policy, there is no plan. It's quite incredible that you're going to operate in a vacuum, and when you've sorted out the difficulties of who owns what, that you intend to give out licences to companies to harvest. So my motion today is to have an open discussion on this, number one. Number two, to hope that we will have general support to the passing of the motion, which my colleague will go into in detail, but which is calling on the government not to give out any licences, to put a hold on it until we have a plan, a policy. I'm open to any name you like to put on it, except that it should be a guiding document as to how we develop a sustainable seaweed sector for the benefit of all, but particularly for the counties on the west coast of Ireland, and traditionally lena cinnta carvacha tá siad ag sábháil na famine. And we must recognise that and move forward. Now, in relation to the actual amendment that you've tabled, you have said that you're working on looking at the difficulties. Now, you recognise that the Minister, yourself, in bringing legal clarity to issues regarding the interface between applications by companies to harvest seaweed and the rights of traditional harvesters. Now, and a benign interpretation of that, that's extremely weak. On my interpretation of it, it's actually disingenuous, because there's no clarity whatsoever in relation to the companies. What you're trying to do, and you learned by accident that traditional harvesters had rights, either because they've exercised those rights down through hundreds of years, or because the right is on their folio, or it was part of the estate that came from the landlord that gave rights in relation to seaweed that was ultimately divided up amongst the tenants. And you were surprised at this. These licences would have been given out before, except that the traditional harvesters galvanised and made you aware of this and said, hold on, we've been doing this either historically, we have rights, or we have rights on our folios, or we've gained rights. And you were in a quandary then as to what to do. And so we have 17 companies, and you might clarify whether they're all companies. My understanding is that they are, but I don't know, waiting for licences. And your intent is to give out those licences once you decide who has rights and who hasn't, without any policy whatsoever. Now, that's frightening. Now, on top of that, just prior to that in your motion, you referred to significant quantities, high volume, low value, and low volume, high value products, and you talk about 30%. I understand that the low volume, high value is at 1%. Not 30%. I'm quoting again from the cross-party reports, and I want to thank the Library Service for their very comprehensive briefing document. So we know that it's 1%. We know there's huge potential in this industry if it's done properly and sustainably. Now, today we witnessed, just coincidentally actually as it happened, a delegation, and I want to welcome them, from Bantry, and we also have visitors from Connemara in relation to this matter, which the protest today was extremely informative. And I went down to the Central Hotel to listen to what they had to say in relation to their concerns in relation to the application that has been granted. So notwithstanding that there's no legal clarity yet, notwithstanding that we have no policy or no plan, you gave out a 10-year licence for the mechanical harvesting of kelp. Now, again, I know that the TDs from that area are going to go into this in detail, but when I read it and when I read the Dáil answers to the questions, I was horrified that a 10-year licence was given in a vacuum, number one. It was given for the mechanical harvesting of kelp, number two, and with a self-monitoring regime. That's an extraordinary concept, that they would self-monitor and give ye the report, as following a 2-week monitoring campaign between March and April, a time picked by them and not reflective at all of what's needed in any essential assessment regime. On top of that, when that application was put into the paper, it was put in a very, very small section of a local paper. It wasn't mentioned that there was going to be mechanical harvesting, and it wasn't mentioned the extent of the area involved. Now, that's just one example of what happens in a vacuum, and when an industry, and I'd prefer to call it the seaweed sector, is developer-led. And that's what's happening, developer-led. We've seen the debacle. I've mentioned the fishing, I've mentioned oil and gas. I also want to mention the company in the west of Ireland that's currently operating. And I have to say, it is the local harvesters that are supplying that company. But the background to that company has been outlined in the report here. And again, lessons should be learned from that. That company was sold off. It was an Údarás na Gaeltachta, the company. It was doing very well, and it was sold off. And in this report, they highlight the serious concerns about the manner in which that was sold off and the absence of a tender, an open tender. Now, I'm restricted by time and I'm not going to go into it, but I mentioned that by way of, at what point are we going to learn At what point are we going to grasp the opportunity that this sector presents? Absolutely wonderful opportunity for development, for the creation of jobs, that ties in with your own policy, that ties in with your Partnership for Government Chapter 4, Jobs and Rural Development, that ties in with CEDRA, the Commission that was set up in relation to development in the Western region. Why can't you grasp this opportunity and go forward in a positive manner so that we can all work together? Thank you very much.